What's going on, you guys? It's your boy John, and a very welcome back to First Person Reviewer. It has been quite some time since my first and last video a couple months back for my introduction to the channel. It's been a long process these last few weeks, but it was very overdue, and I'm just very grateful that it's all come together at the right time, allowing me to commit to this channel and making the best possible content for you guys. Although it's been quite some time since its air and finale, as I mentioned in my intro video, today's video is going to be The Mandalorian Season 2. Full disclosure before moving forward, although this should go without saying, this will be a full-on spoiler review of major spoilers for each and every episode. So if you somehow managed to not get it spoiled by now, kudos to you, but go watch that shit right now. Today's episode is also marking the very first entry in my Star Wars review series. With so much existing Star Wars content and a plethora of Disney Plus shows on their way, I really kind of wanted to separate Star Wars as a whole from my regular content on my channel. With this series in the future, I'll be discussing the Skywalker saga and the spin-offs, some of my favorite Star Wars games, and most of the animated series such as the Clone Wars and Rebels. There's a lot of Star Wars that I am so excited to talk about on this channel, but most of all, I am most excited for today's video. I've been waiting for this since October, since I made the channel, and we're finally here, so let's get right to it with The Mandalorian Season 2.
I agreed to take you back to your own kind, so that's what I need to do. You understand, right?
Before we begin, if you're interested in hearing about a particular episode and don't want to listen to me fanboy about Star Wars for 20 minutes, feel free to utilize these timestamps. You can also click on the timestamp links in the description or comments below. Chapter 9, The Marshal, actually marks Jon Favreau's directorial debut within this series, which is honestly baffling to me considering that he is the primary writer of this series. But to no surprise, Jon absolutely knocks it out of the park with the direction this episode. Both him and Dave are such true fans of this world, and it is on full display throughout this entire season, really. They respect the lore and they respect the fans, and they know how to expand the lore further without disrespecting it or ignoring what was previously established. The Marshal also marks the longest runtime of an episode within the series thus far, making it more of a short film rather than its standard chapters. This episode does take Mando and the audience back to Tatooine yet again for a second time, and oh boy.
Does that mean we get to go to some amazing place?
We sure do. The Kanto region!
Oh boy, Kanto, huh?
Guys, I get it. Tatooine is an iconic location amongst Star Wars and just within the science fiction genre alone. The twin suns are a legendary shot. Scum and villainy, Tashi converters, I get it. We get it, I get it. But for the love of God, can we please go somewhere else? Nevertheless, the return to Tatooine pays off immensely due to Jon's fantastic direction and his spaghetti western direction style of this episode. Along with two new very welcomed additions, the titular character, the Marshal, played by Timothy Olyphant, adorned with Boba Fett's armor, and the Krayt Dragon from A New Hope, which Mando agrees to aid the Marshal in killing in exchange for Boba's armor. Prior to this, we've only ever gotten a glimpse of the Krayt Dragon in A New Hope when C-3PO and R2-D2 are wandering the deserts and come across its skeletal remains. It was just an absolute blast to see this thing come to life at this scale with some very mind-blowing effects in the episode's climax. I do have to address one thing. The storytelling of this episode, and really throughout most of this season, is undeniably trope heavy. But nevertheless, it is trope done right, and trope done right can still make for some excellent content. Star Wars doesn't need to redefine the genre or defy storytelling each and every entry. In fact, most of the best parts of Star Wars and its now massive story are its more simpler ones, such as A New Hope. Although formulaic at times, The Marshal is a fun, exciting, well-paced prologue to this season, and really delivered some impressive action pieces and thrills, while also giving some really great Easter eggs like Anakin's pod racer engine from The Phantom Menace, Boba's faulty jetpack from Return of the Jedi, the Great Dragon Probe from the Extended Universe Legend, and the pinnacle of this chapter, the return of Tamora Morrison's Boba Fett. The Marshal was an all-around great time while delivering some new content and was a 10 out of 10 episode for me, ranking number 5 on my top 5 spot of episodes this season. Chapter 10, The Passenger, is directed by Peyton Reed, who you might be familiar with his work on the Ant-Man from the MCU. This episode as a whole is widely regarded to as the weakest episode of the season for some reason, and I personally have to wholeheartedly disagree. This episode really surpasses the first for me, even with a shorter runtime and a less tight story focus. In fact, it's the loose story kind of side quest feel to the episode that really works most for me. We had a very brief taste of this with chapters 4 and 6 of last season, but in my opinion, neither one of them excelled with this kind of side mission like storytelling as much as this one did. All while still perfectly stitching together the concurrent main storyline of finding the Jedi and bringing Baby Yoda to his people, especially with the introduction of a new character and my favorite character from this season, Frog Lady. Frog Lady. I mean, literally, like, she's legitimately credited as Frog Lady. Like, I mean, who was in charge of this? Like, who couldn't think of a name for this lady? This new character is paired with Mando on a journey across space to get her eggs, which are the last of her kind, to her husband, so that he can, in return, point Mando to the Mandalorians that he's been searching for. What really works best for me is the language barrier between these two characters and how it is utilized once they become stranded on an ice planet after an X-Wing pursuit. But the language barrier between the two really sets the stakes for this episode, as Frog Lady is desperately trying to convey to Mando how essential it is that these eggs do not freeze, but he simply cannot understand her, and he's trying to fix the Razor Crest at the same time. There was also a controversy in this episode surrounding Baby Yoda and these eggs, and the fact that he is relentlessly trying to eat them the entire episode, and I'm sorry, it did not bother me at all. I mean, this is not real. This is not a real person. Baby Yoda is a doll. These eggs are props. He's also a child. And literally in season 1, he swallows a whole frog. I'm sorry, I didn't understand that. But the tension of this episode absolutely soars when the three of them become surrounded by a horde of these alien ice spider creatures, very reminiscent of the one seen in Rebels. Holy shit, this scene was intense. I was at the edge of my damn seat the entire time. It was insane, and it was beautifully shot. This episode really delivered for me in suspense, and even in heart. I really felt for this Frog Lady, even though she was a character I couldn't even understand what she was saying. But I most of all admire it for dipping its toes into some horror genre aspects and trying out some new things and really just delivering a lot of new content. There were very few callbacks this episode, the least of the entire season, really. Chapter 10 ranks as number 4 in my top 5 episodes of this season. Chapter 11 is a return to the director's chair for Bryce Dallas Howard after her debut in Chapter 4 of Season 1. Bryce is actually one of my favorite actresses, and it really surprised me that she was even interested in directing a Star Wars project at all. With that being said, she has really surprised me at both times that she was at the helm of these episodes, with Chapter 11 definitely surpassing Chapter 4. 11 delivers yet another standout episode from this season, continuing the pattern of the first season, where the first 3 episodes acted as a kind of condensed arc where each one really surpassed the last. Honestly, getting to see Frog Lady reunite with her husband this episode, along with the assurance that her eggs and family are going to live on, truly melted my heart. I care more about Frog Lady and Frogman within a span of 2 episodes and about 30 combined minutes than I have ever cared about a single sequel trilogy character in the last 6 years. But the real core and star of this episode is the Heiress herself, Lady Bo-Katan of House Kryze, reprised by Katie Sackhoff in her very first live action appearance. The transition of this character from animation to live action is glorious and so meticulously executed. At the very least, from the Clone Wars Bo-Katan, I was truthfully never really fond of her design in Rebels. I do not know why they designed her that way, but Katie is absolutely fantastic this episode. She owns the character of Bo-Katan. She is just as good as her voice acting in the animated series, if not better. I just can't see anyone else playing the character at this point. All in all, between Frog Lady reuniting with her husband, the introduction of Bo-Katan in live action, the beautiful cinematography, and a brutal final action sequence featuring the Mandalorian squad aboard an Imperial starship in search of Moff Gideon, absolutely demolishing stormtroopers left and right. Chapter 11 ranks as number 3 among my top 5 favorite episodes, joining its 2 predecessing chapters as some of the best content this season. Chapter 12 The Siege is directed by Carl Weathers. Carl fucking Weathers!
You son of a bitch.
We are in a world where Carl Weathers and Bryce Dallas Howard have directed Star Wars. That is just bonkers to even say. But to be quite frank, The Siege is actually my least favorite episode of this season, and in my personal opinion, the weakest episode of the season. It is by no means terrible or even a bad episode, and not nearly as bad as Chapter 5 of last season, which was just awful. I skip it every time. But I really feel that most of the criticism that Chapter 10 received for being inconsequential filler applies more to this episode than it does to The Passenger. Mando has to literally stop what he's doing this episode and go out of his way in order to aid his old friends from season 1, Greef Karga and Cara Dune, in return for really just getting his ship, the Razor Crest, repaired. In Chapter 10, he is tasked with transporting the Frog Lady in exchange for information, which then leads him and the audience to Bo-Katan and Ahsoka in the following episodes. Them becoming stranded really acts more as a setback which halts progression, where here Mando intentionally drops what he's doing entirely to help a completely unrelated task to the main plot. Now, I have no issue with filler when it is done right, because just as I said, even Chapter 10, one of my favorite episodes, is filler-ish at its core. But the goal with this episode is very transparently to retcon everything that the sequel trilogy messed up with Snoke and Palpatine. Other than a very excellently shot and exciting chase sequence featuring some scout troopers that are one of my favorite troopers, this episode is fundamentally inconsequential and doesn't really have much else to offer other than some cool action and some exposition that's only job is to clean up the mess of the sequel trilogy. Also, the blue alien guy that was Mando's target in the first season makes a comeback this episode, and I just do not care for him at all. He stuck out like a sore thumb in that first episode for me, and he sticks out even more in this episode, and is just played off for comedic relief that just does not work for me. Honestly, the most memorable thing about this episode, other than the Dark Trooper reveal, was probably Blue Jeans Man. Chapter 13 is written and directed by none other than Dave Filoni himself, and is without a question my number 1 episode from this season, hands down. This episode was a sight for some very tired eyes, and it was just everything I could have ever dreamt of, starting with the absolute flawless casting of Rosario Dawson as Ahsoka. While I was already confident about her fitting the role physically, any bit of skepticism that I had about her portrayal of the character flew out the window the second she comes on screen. It's very apparent that Rosario did her homework on this character, and she plays such amazing tribute and respect to Ashley Eckstein's character. Now, I do have to admit the inconsistencies with Ahsoka's Montrals and Lekus, or for the more casual fans, the horns and tail-like features on her head, they were quite bothersome at first glance. The Togruta species Leku and horns grow massively as they continue to age, and Rosario's headpiece here was very inconsistent with the last appearance of Ahsoka in Rebels, matching more with her appearance in the Clone Wars in her adolescent years. Apparently this was done for practicality, as Rosario actually did do most of her stunts and flips and combat, which is really a worthy trade, I guess, for, better practicality, but It was still done in George's prequel trilogy with Jedi Master Shaak Ti, so I was a little confused there, but at the end of the day, it's a worthy trade. Aside from this discrepancy though, the character is brilliantly transitioned into live action, from her mannerisms and combat style to even her ignition of her dual lightsabers. Although Ahsoka is the centerpiece of this chapter and really steals the show, there was so much that this episode had to offer, like another brand new location from Dave, the planet of Corvus, a new villainess, the Magistrate, who was wielding a Beskar spear, Ahsoka subtly referencing Anakin and the Clone Wars as she talks to Mando about her experience with the Jedi, and a very huge, very overdue, and very satisfying name drop for Baby Yoda. The crossroads of the world of Star Wars really come together this episode, as so many plot lines from not just The Mandalorian, but as far back as the Clone Wars and Rebels all tie in together at once in such a beautiful way with some absolutely stunning cinematography. Dave once again cements himself as George's rightful successor and really just exemplifies why he should be leading the franchise as a whole. Chapter 14, The Tragedy, is directed by one of the wackiest and most creative directors in the industry, Robert Rodriguez. The director roster this season was just insane. The sole goal of this episode is to get Grogu atop of an ancient site on the planet Tython, where Grogu can use the Force to activate a beacon that any other Jedi across the galaxy will sense and come and reclaim him. After this is triggered, we get our first real appearance by Boba Fett since Chapter 1 of this season, who has been tailing Mando across the stars in an attempt to obtain his armor back. We also get a return from Fennec Shan, which was such a welcome surprise because she was probably the sole thing that I enjoyed from Chapter 5 of last season, and I was thoroughly upset with the decision to kill her off and the decision to waste a talent such as Ming-Na Wen. She returns with a cybernetic abdomen implant after being shot in Episode 5, which is just as bizarre and badass as it sounds. She's also reappearing in the Bad Batch animated series, which I am very much looking forward to. But obviously, the absolute star of this episode was Boba Fett. Getting to see this character get the respect that he so desperately deserved, both out of and in his armor, just put the biggest smile on my face. This episode really has some of the best action of this season. As for bizarre action is Robert's specialty. All in all, The Tragedy was far from one and was a very exciting and fun entry this season. I'm looking forward to seeing Robert Rodriguez hopefully direct another episode. Despite its short runtime, this episode was such a blast and I loved it. Chapter 15, The Believer, is directed by Rick Famuyiwa. I'm sorry if I butchered that. A relatively low-key writer and director who honestly surprised me in terms of direction this episode. But if I'm being honest, this episode really does feel a little odd to me and kind of sidelined a bit. We're reunited with Bill Burr's Mayfeld, which was very enjoyable. He's a character that I actually really like, and I feel that his character achieves the normal guy in Star Wars character type way better than that blue guy does. Boba's armor receives a very fresh paint job after 15 years of being an absolute G. And there's a very impressive chase scene featuring Mando and some pirates aboard the tops of these truck transporter things that was a lot of fun. It really just feels like that should have been the penultimate leading into the final episode. I honestly forgot there was 2 more episodes after that. There is one very standout scene from this episode where Mando actually has to take his helmet off in order to fool an Imperial officer, which ends up with him and Mayfeld at a table with a very tense conversation, which leads to Mayfeld just bombarding this guy with nothing but the truth, really. And it was very enjoyable to watch, very tense, very thrilling, and surprising. I was not expecting him to just get up and start blasting their way out of there. And the recurring theme of Mando kind of questioning his beliefs and the whole "this is the way" thing, it was all very well handled. The story and the structure was there and it was good. I just felt that the episodes could have switched slots, would have made for a bit more better pacing leading up to the final episode. This episode does feature one of my favorite Easter eggs from the series, though, the return of the Slave One seismic charges from Attack of the Clones, which makes one of my favorite noises in the whole world.
Well, we won't be seeing him again.
This episode is once again helmed by Peyton Reed, who also directed one of my other favorite episodes, so naturally I was very excited to see what he had up his sleeve with this finale, and he did not disappoint. This episode is balls to the walls Star Wars action and thrills, and it barely takes a breath for most of its second and third act. This episode is the culmination and pinnacle of this story that was set up in Chapter 1 of Season 1 when both the Mando and the audience are introduced to Grogu for the first time, and every last string from then comes together here in an epic climactic conclusion. The scene where Mando becomes isolated with one of the Dark Troopers and it highlights just how much he's struggling to take out one of these is so brilliantly executed and has such a rewarding and tremendous payoff towards the episode's climax. Getting to see this roster of characters that have accumulated over the last 2 seasons assembled together in an Avenger-style fashion was such a reward. I cannot praise the direction and the action choreography of this episode enough, especially the long-awaited showdown between Mando and Moff Gideon. Giancarlo Esposito was a superb antagonist to this series. Not to mention just how impressive it was that a non-force sensitive Moff Imperial had the combat training to even go toe-to-toe with a Mandalorian nonetheless. But one of the grandest moments of this episode, this season, this series, and arguably Star Wars within the last 15 years came within the shape of a very particular X-Wing and a very particular one-handed Jedi.
Oh my God! Okay, it's happening. Everybody stay calm.
What's the
Everybody
procedure,
stay calm.
everyone? What's the procedure?
Stay calm.
This scene was perfection. From the original score, the parallel of the Vader hallway scene in Rogue One, and the glorious reveal of Mark Hamill when he enters the room was just... it was a thing of beauty. While the CGI was not the best and definitely a little wonky at first glance, I by no means did not think it was terrible. Many people were ripping it apart as they love to do, but honestly, I thought it was pretty consistent with the Rogue One Leia CGI, which also wasn't the best at the time, but just above average to get the job done. It wasn't nearly as good as the Luke CGI from Rise of Skywalker, but that was also under very different lighting. I'd be lying if I said that Grogu's farewell to Mando was not the most heartwarming, touching, tear-jerking moment of all of last year. While this episode was perfect in every way and gave me everything I could have possibly wanted, it still does rank number 2 among my top 5 episodes because I really do feel that Chapter 13, The Jedi, has the advantage of the stronger narrative. Nevertheless, The Rescue is a masterfully directed chapter that really offers some of the best Star Wars content in recent years in just a single episode. And the entire season and series so far has really offered some of the most spectacular storytelling and moments of the Star Wars franchise to date. Oh, I almost forgot the biggest thing, the Book of Boba Fett. The season concludes with both Boba Fett and Fennec Shand arriving back on Tatooine to find a very abnormally sized Bib Fortuna on Jabba's throne. Boba gets some well-deserved revenge and takes the throne for himself, turning Jabba's palace into Boba Fett's palace, and thus begins the Book of Boba Fett. Now, many fans are speculating that this will actually be the focus of Season 3 of The Mandalorian, given that the Grogu arc has come to a resolve. I do not believe that this will be the case, as there is still the unresolved matter of Bo-Katan and the Darksaber and reclaiming Mandalore. But I'm looking forward to both things. I'm looking forward to Star Wars in general. We are finally back. We are finally back in a beautiful place where Star Wars can expand the lore and acknowledge what came before, but not be consumed by it or dictated by it. Just a gradual respect for the fans and the lore while expanding the stories and characters that we love, and hopefully someday seeing some new ones. I'm going to give The Mandalorian Season 2 a 9.5 out of 10. Well, that is all for now, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you made it this far, I appreciate it wholeheartedly. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like and subscribe. It means the absolute world and is a tremendous help. Stay tuned for WandaVision, stay tuned for March Madness, and stay tuned for the next first-person reviewer video. Take care, guys.